Hello and welcome to Gruntworks. My name is Brother Logan Isaac, and I'm broadcasting this morning from Laguna Beach, California. This is GruntGod Chapter 4 on the Divine Warrior, the Armor of God with Tremper Longman. And just really quickly, I'm out of town today, so I'm recording from my in-laws in Laguna Beach. But this is a really important chapter. It's the title chapter of the book. If Jesus is God, then God is a grunt. And Tremper wrote a book in the 90s that I picked up in seminary called God is a Warrior. And he goes into, with his co-author, Dan Reed, goes into some of the divine warrior language, motif, symbolism. And in his book, they outline this kind of five-part structure to help Christians understand what God might be doing with this violence that is not hidden. They don't seem to be ashamed of it. There's all kinds of writings from pacifists and patriots or conservatives and progressives about what do we do with this violence? Is it prescriptive literature? Do we get to do what we see the Israelites doing against Amalek and the other tribes of the Canaanite plateau or the plain? Or is it this thing that tells us what not to do? Because it's harder to argue because God frequently says things prescriptively to do this thing to the Israelites. And I take that Jesus is a warrior, God is a warrior, comes from Exodus 15, verse 3, where the Israelites have just fled Pharaoh. They've just successfully gone through the Sea of Reeds or the Red Sea and watched the water close in on Pharaoh's chariots. Now they were an exiled people. They were slaves when they were in Egypt, and they look back at one of the most powerful nations the world had known at that time and have seen that they have defeated them effectively. Is that their doing? Is that some supernatural miracle that they attribute to God? And the second is true. And they break out into song, the song of the sea, or the song of Moses, where it begins with God is a warrior, Yahweh is God's name, and it goes on to they've dashed the chariots of Egypt, and it's really difficult. And it doesn't end in Exodus 15. It goes on through the rest of Torah and in Joshua and in Judges, where they commit violence against other tribes. And so, if God is a warrior, and one of the important pieces of that line from Exodus 15:3 is that the language is such that a lot of scholars believe that it's a very old part of the Bible. And we know from anthropology and historical critical methods that songs and poems are very frequently the oldest form of human composition. If anybody is into sociology or anthropology, like I didn't grow up in Hawaii, but I learned a lot as a nature tour guide in Hawaii. And they didn't have a written language until the settlers came, the Congregationalist missionaries came and made English characters for the Hawaiian language, but they didn't have anything written. And they had an entire creation myth that they memorized hundreds of lines long. It's just like Homer's Iliad. Imagine if you had memorized that as a child or as a teen. That's what the human brain is capable of. And so the easiest things for us to remember, what we do to remember things is put them into verse, rhythmic verse, rhyming verse, something that helps us remember, because these are symbols that we attribute something greater than simply, their definition, right? We think of mythology as giving meaning to the stories that we tell about where we came from. And that's what a lot of Genesis and even wider Torah and even part of the Deuteronomic history in Joshua and Judges, that's what's going on. So this conversation is one of the most important ones, I think, of the Grunt God season pass with Tremper Longman, this really incredible scholar. We have a great conversation. I was actually very surprised. That sounds bad. I was pleasantly refreshed with the level of conversation that we had. And I think it does some justice to the importance of this chapter. What do we do with Jesus being God and God's most difficult edges for us to understand in commanding violence? I won't go into much of it here, but I do think you'll really appreciate this conversation with Tremper Longman on the divine warrior motif and God being a warrior. And don't forget, this is just the fourth chapter of 13 in the GruntGod season pass. I hope you'll go check that out at pewpewhq.com/merch. You can get all of the 13 chapters and episodes ad free. You'll get the ebook of God as a Grunt when it's released on November 11th. But also, as I'm laying out these chapters, there are also certain things along the way that I hope my audience will participate in, including GruntCon. GruntCon is going to be the first meeting of, I hope, many for other rank and file believers to come to Albany, Oregon, and have some of these conversations about what it means to be a rank and file believer in our world today. What does it mean to look at our scripture and our traditions and our theologies through the lens of grunts, through rank and file believers? Think about what it means to do the work from the bottom up, beginning with the poor and lowly and letting things unfold from there. So I hope you'll check out GruntCon at pewpewhq.com/GruntCon. You can also get the GruntGod season pass. You can still buy the hardcover for, I think it's for sale at $26, but this is all also building up to the re-release of God as a Grunt in paperback, where you can also get the ebook all in one, as well as all of these episodes ad free. So thank you for listening. Thank you for following. I hope you enjoy the following conversation that I have with Tremper Longman, an incredible scholar. He seems to have done it all, both editorial theology as well as he's been teaching at Westmont for some time. I think he's an emeritus now, and he's still writing, just a lot of these scholars do. And I'm really looking forward to a lot of the work that he's continuing to put out. But also just, I really like this conversation. I think you will too. Thank you for listening. Here is our conversation about the divine warrior in Scripture. Thank you, Dr. Tremper Longman III, teacher, author, professor of the Old Testament. I appreciate you being here with me. We're here to talk today about a very loaded topic, and it's one that I'm still wrestling with. And you may notice in the text, in the chapter, God is a Grunt, it's kind of the title chapter. Jesus is God, God is a Grunt. And I came to that because my read, particularly of the New Testament, is Jesus has this opportunity to accept greater favor, privilege, power, and he consistently seems to prefer these lowly statuses, which is this paradox of, from Exodus 15:3, God is a warrior, and the divine armor motif. I'm fascinated in how that tension plays out within the Bible, and of course in our own in national and international politics. Would you say a little bit about, I clung very closely, at least, to the framework in God is a Warrior. And what year did this come out? Do you remember?
Yeah, it was 1995. Yeah.
95. So
Yeah.
a lot may have, I'd love for you to share more about what went into that book with Dan Reed and what has shifted. Is there anything that you'd like to update or address in light of anything that's happened since?
Yeah, thank you, Logan, and call me Tremper. So that book came out in 1995, and I started working on the theological theme of God as a warrior in 1981. It was when I did some initial papers, wrote some articles, and Dan Reed, who's a New Testament scholar, and had a PhD from Fuller, where he wrote on the theme from the New Testament time period. And then he was working as editor at InterVarsity, who is my editor. So we decided to write the book together, published by Zondervan, not IVP. But yeah, to be honest, it was so long ago. I'm so old. I don't have real memory of why I got intrigued by this theme. I think maybe I read something by Patrick Miller, who taught at Princeton back in the day, that kind of got me thinking or sensitized me to the issue. And then as I was reading scripture, it just really hit me how pervasive the picture of God as a warrior is in the Old Testament. Not a lot of people were working on it. And to be honest, in 1995, not a lot of people were really interested in the theme or even really concerned about it now. And it is But since then, one of the big things that has happened and also has got me thinking in not different ways, but different directions or with different questions is what happened in 9/11. You know, what happened 9/11 just all of a sudden galvanized people about, wait a minute, Osama bin Laden sounds a heck of a lot like Joshua.
Hmm.
And so that raised the ethical concerns that I think most mainline evangelicals and even evangelical scholars weren't really digging into. Now, there was one group that was, and that's Mennonite scholars,
Yeah.
church scholars like John Yoder and others, and so forth. They were raising the issue because, of course, they were from a pacifist tradition.
Yeah.
But yeah, so to answer one part of your question, I could go on for 20 minutes. I probably shouldn't do that.
That, that would
Uh,
probably be fine. But anyway,
but I think what drew my attention after 9/11 is are the ethical questions connected to the divine warrior theme. And in my most recent book on it, Confronting Old Testament Controversies, I interact with scholars with who I definitely respect, appreciate, love. They're in the case of Pete Enns, he's one of my closest friends, but we have a difference of opinion about how Christians should appropriate the divine warrior theme.
yeah. And
But yeah,
you mentioned
yeah,
9/11, your
yeah,
mind goes to Joshua. And one of the things I talk about in the chapter, and something I'm still really wrestling with, in particular around evangelical theologians like Pete, and I'll even the Bible Project, I think, up in Portland, Tim Mackey. As a veteran, I spent six
yeah,
years in the artillery. So it's not like some support MOS where I happen to be in the military. Like I came to Christ through my uniform.
yeah.
And one of the things that I say in the book that I'm still really wrestling with, as I've said, is when we say Jesus, it's a fourth century invention from Jerome. The Orthodox Church, the Greeks will still say Yehoshua ben Nun, right? Joshua son of Nun, or Yehoshua ben Miriam, Joshua son of Mary.
Mm,
The anglicized form of the name of Christ is Joshua.
right.
And when I heard that, I immediately, not immediately, but I began reading Joshua with a little bit more attention. And
Mm,
I later found, which I mentioned very briefly, I think, in the book, but its implications seem significant. The the high priest at the time of the exile or coming home from the exile, responsible for building the second temple under which Judaism flourishes, is Joshua, son of Jehozadak.
yeah.
God is righteous, is his father's name. His father Jehozadak didn't get to participate in the priestly rituals because they were in exile. There was no temple.
Mm,
And so they come back. Zerubbabel is the governor of Yehuda, the province of Yehuda under Syria, and the Syrian emperor Cyrus the elder. He gives Israel money, and he is called the Anointed in at least one place. I want to say in Isaiah. And so for me, I write my first book, Reborn on the 4th of July. I described my upbringing as like a typical evangelical, like we're Americans, so we're Christian, and Jesus and John Wayne kind of stuff. And a lot of things, and as I got out of the military, I was caught I read Yoder's Nevertheless and his typology of pacifism. And I read Gandhi and Tolstoy. But when I got to Yoder and Hauerwas, the things that the pacifist imagination was left either forced to say in silence or they wouldn't say because they couldn't quite get around to it is like Joshua and Judges seems to tell a story, an idealized story of Israel's own colonializing history and their failure to hold together a confederated group of states. We have 50 states in America and we have this federal system and it's not entirely unlike it. And so what does it mean? What do you think might we infer as believers in this book that Joshua is the name of the military commander, name of the high priest with a very modest temple that Herod destroyed down to its foundations, according to Josephus. And the Messiah shares these names. It's both military commander and high priest in one. I'm nervous about the implications, but I want to hear from you. What does that draw up in you, and what kind of implications or inferences are safe, and which ones maybe we might look to developing more concretely?
There's a lot there, Logan, and I think your description of the name relationship, which implies a kind of thematic or typological
Yeah.
connection between the Joshuas, is really good. And I would say that as a general statement, I think what it implies, or what it suggests once we dig into it, is that there is continuity and discontinuity between the Old Testament and New Testament. And actually, I hadn't thought about it, to be honest, because I think it's a good insight about the priest Joshua, who may be signaling a transition from the physical warfares of the Old Testament to the spiritual warfare,
Yeah.
Jesus, in the first period of time between the cross and the second coming. So, as because you summarized my view quite well in your book, as I read the Bible, I see a kind of five-phase development of this theme that again are characterized by continuity and discontinuity
Yeah.
in a way that does not allow me to disown the Old Testament, as my buddy Pete Enns essentially does when he
He's
says that.
closer to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, his basic view is that the Old Testament depiction of God is not the actual God, but that
Mm.
God is allowing Israel to describe God in terms that they're familiar with. And and no, I don't think so. And then of course it raises the whole issue. You at one point referred to scholars who think of the conquest and the period of Judges as kind of idealized or retrojections, which
Yeah.
is not my view. I think actually, and I think I told you before we started recording that one of the books I'm writing now is The Old Testament as History, where I will take much more, what's the right word, optimistic view, but not a fundamentalist view of the
Mhm.
history. What the history that we get is shaped, and sometimes we romanticize. Sometimes the Bible will give us a hyperbolic and certainly a selective presentation of the history for theological reasons. But I do think that it's still legitimate to talk about a conquest and a period of judges. I think actually there's much more unanimity about the period of Judges than there is about the conquest.
Yeah.
But basically, just real quickly, and maybe you at some point want to follow up on this, the five phases are in the Old Testament, you get lots of accounts of God fighting on behalf of Israel against Israel's flesh and blood enemies. Anybody familiar with the Old Testament will know countless stories, Jericho.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
It's not all
AI.
battle. Sometimes it's like this collective corporal punishment.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, I would put AI or I in the second phase, which is
Mm.
sometimes fights against
Right.
Israel.
Yeah.
And then ultimately they take AI. But then at the end of the Old Testament time period, when they're living in exile and they're helpless under this oppression of the Babylonians and the Persians, ultimately the Greeks and the Romans after the Old Testament time period, the prophets like Daniel, Zechariah, and Malachi come with a message, which is you can see this especially in a place like Daniel 7. In spite of your
Mm.
oppressive circumstances, God is in control. He'll have the final victory. He'll come as a warrior to save you from your oppressors. And the message, by the way, is to keep God's people from becoming fearful and angry. But then when Jesus comes, he circumvents the expectation. I mean, even of John the Baptist. John the Baptist is saying, the one who's coming after me is going to burn up all the chaff. He's going to
Yeah.
chop out the rotten
And
wood.
they
And
have this disagreement. Like, I think a lot, I
yeah,
haven't encountered very many scholars who read Jesus and John's relationship in the way that I have. In
yeah,
Luke 7, like in the next chapter, when I talk about GIs in the New Testament, I left it out, but I'm so fascinated that Jesus and John have this disagreement.
yeah,
John is like, you're not anti-imperialist enough. Why are you healing a
right,
centurion's son?
right.
And Jesus has this, he's threading this very thin needle of John is the one who came before. Do not undermine anything that he said. But, and he has this, I don't know, I think, and what even what John does in Luke 3:14 when he talks to these soldiers, he says, don't sycophanteo, don't polish my figs. Anyway, I wanted to go back really quickly about the Old Testament and what we lose sight of, because one of the things that kind of clicked for me is this modern invention of history as a series of factual events. And to then take that anachronistically and put it on the Bible and say, aha, they're telling us what happened, they're just mistaken. And it wasn't until like Herodotus where the Western world began looking at history as a linear chronological series of events. But even before Herodotus and the Greeks like Homer, it's like history is narrative. It's not, we only know what we've seen and what we experience in our own interpretation of it. So we prevailed because we tell ourselves we prevailed. And of course, Israel has these stories about the conquest that look exactly like all these other cultures patting themselves on the back. And that is one of my concerns with some of the scholars that gently pass over Joshua and Judges to say, oh, it didn't happen. It's all mythological. But even if that's true, like, what do you think that you mentioned a little bit, what that mythos is trying to do is to remind us not to be afraid, that God is in control, to let go of the idea perhaps of the supremacy of human agency. Is
Yeah.
that, is there a better way to say that, or is that
I
cohesive?
Oh, what you're saying is very cohesive. I would, though, argue that there is something historical behind it. Okay. It's not like
I
nothing
agree.
happened. Joshua, so, and sometimes people misunderstand mythology as if it isn't that, but scholars tend to
It's
use
poo-pooed a lot,
yeah. So
unfortunately.
so the way I understand it, and you have to evaluate different parts of the Old Testament differently on this topic, but let's take the conquest. So, classically, in historical critical approaches to the conquest, you'll have people who will pit Joshua 1 through 12 against Judges 1. So, Joshua 1 through 12, and no doubt about it, you read Joshua 11 and 12, if you were approaching it as a straight factual presentation, you'd have to conclude that Joshua took everything.
Yeah,
But then you read Judges 1 and actually you read Judges 13 and
yeah.
follow, and you take a look at what Judges 13 and following say about the land that remains. Joshua at best took 40, 50% of the land. And there was a lot more fighting to do later. And the conquest actually isn't completed. And we could
Hmm.
talk about what completed means till the time of David. David's
Yeah,
the conquest completer. But on the other hand, and you were totally right to say they're writing history and they're using the past like their contemporaries. And Lawson Younger wrote this very significant and influential doctoral dissertation years ago, which is still widely cited by me and many others, that talks about ancient Near Eastern battle reports.
Yeah.
And so you have to ask the question, what is Joshua 1 through 12? What is it doing? I say there is a real conquest behind it. It's not there's a use of hyperbole here for logical purposes in order to celebrate the beginning of the fulfillment of the promise of land. So you have to ask those kind of historical questions. And I also want to emphasize that in terms of the topic we're talking about today, because sometimes some people will say, well, the conquest never really happened, with the implication of the picture of God as a warrior is not an ethical issue. It's no,
Yeah.
if you'd have to ask the question, why are they depicting God? This is their understanding of God. And on what basis would we disown that understanding of God? Yeah. So this is
Hmm.
the topic of you brought up is one that would be fun to pursue in and of itself.
Yeah, I think we're going to take a break in just a moment, but I really want to hear the continuation of the framework that you build in God as a Warrior and carry it through into what it means for the New Testament and for today. So stick around, keep listening. We'll be right back after the break. Okay. Now that we're back, I wanted to carry our conversation about the Old Testament and literature and narrative and the people that produced it and talk a little bit about the New Testament and what believers today might be able to take from it. It's a divisive concept. The rise of nationalism, I'll say, and the expectation that our nation, I read, so I, it's hard to put into words in safe but meaningful language. Maybe kind of the problem. If God is a warrior, what's to stop us? And I guess this is my question to carry us into the New Testament. Why should God not war for us? Like we talked about 9/11 and Osama bin Laden's language around overthrowing oppressors. What is wrong with a nation like ours using that same language to assert our interests overseas?
Yeah. So the reason why is because another element of John the Baptist and Jesus disagreement had to do with the fact that, as you said, John was wondering why Jesus wasn't warring against their oppressors. The way Jesus responded in Matthew 11 to his two disciples who come up and say, "Are you the one or should we expect another?" is he goes out and he heals the sick, he exorcises demons, he preaches the good news. So basically, what that signals, along with a whole bunch of other stuff in the New Testament, is that Jesus is heightening and intensifying the battle. So now it's directed toward the spiritual powers and authority. And those evil powers aren't defeated with weapons like swords and spears. Put away your sword, Jesus says to Peter when he's being arrested. But my way is to Jerusalem, which is then saying we defeat them not by killing but by dying,
Yeah.
putting down our life. And so that's why Paul in Colossians 2:13 to 15 uses military language to describe the crucifixion, the resurrection. Ephesians 4:8 cites Psalm 68, which is a divine warrior hymn in terms of the ascension. Now, so we might come back to what, and this is what I'm calling stage 4.
Mhm.
Jesus defeats the spiritual powers and authority. But then I would also go on and say, I don't think Jesus is saying that John is wrong. I think he's
Yeah.
saying that John is speaking truth, but he doesn't know how it's going to play out.
You said earlier heightening and intensifying. And if
Yeah,
I'm hearing you, and I think there's a view that is more pervasive that the spiritual realm is somehow over there and it's to move into the spiritual realm is to diffuse instead of to intensify. And
yeah,
as a veteran, like I've been to combat and the worst thing that can happen is not that you die or are killed. The worst thing that can happen is you're an asshole and you don't get a chance to redeem your character. Like I would jump on a grenade in a second. But if the last thing I did, or one of the last things I did was something wrong, I can't correct it. And one of the, I have this essay idea that might be a book, Onward, Spiritual Warfare for Rank and File Believers. Like I think spiritual warfare is about principled nonviolence, applying pressure, intense pressure, publicly to people who are abusing the power that is given to them. So I think of like Jesus in when he enters Jerusalem in, I want to say in Mark, he comes to the temple to do his tossing. Nobody's there. There's no audience. So he leaves. He comes back when there's people there, and then he throws it up. And he's making a whole scene. It's street theater. Would you say more about the Manichaean distinction, even like the Platonic dualism distinction between like spirituality and materiality? I think that if there's a spiritual realm, I think there is, it's actually closer to reality or God than the physical realm. And I don't want to like this, I don't want to say our bodies are bad, but like you really got to think about character and conscience and virtue if you're going to follow Jesus.
Yes, in terms of the connection between the spiritual and the material, we get a glimpse of that in the Old Testament in a place like Daniel 10,
Mhm.
where Daniel has this disturbing vision, and eventually an interpreting angel shows up and he says, "We wanted to get here quicker, but we
Yeah,
were delayed by the spirit prince of Persia." But Michael, your angel, fought through them. And so you get this idea of the connection between spiritual warfare and human evil. And that's why in the Old Testament, we're never invited into that battle. They're never invited
Hmm.
into that battle. But
Ah,
when
I
you
hadn't
come
thought
to
about that.
Ephesians 6:10 and following in other places, put on the whole armor of
Yeah,
God. Again, the fight is directed toward the spiritual powers and authority, which which to me also signals that we never ever use physical violence or even some types of coercive
Hmm.
behavior toward even evil human beings. Not And unfortunately, that doesn't mean we don't resist them, we don't challenge them, we don't protest,
Right,
we don't try to coerce non-Christians to act like Christians, say,
right.
uh, one way or another, or impose our Christian values on the broader world, which is very relevant to the kind of culture war thing that's going on
Yeah, what
today.
you said about being invited in,
Yeah.
and one of the backgrounding kind of elements, the divine armor, I didn't develop as much in this book, but I've since continued to think about it. We have Isaiah 59:17, the breastplate of righteousness and the helmet of salvation. It carried through Paul and wisdom, and there's pieces of it all over. But as you said, I thought, yeah, in the Old Testament, the Israelites were not invited to be like God. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just kind of like brainstorming as I'm trying. They're not invited to be like God. If anything, be very clear. You are not God. I am God. I'm going to do these things through you, but you're not me.
Yeah.
But in Christ, there is a kind of invitation. Pick up your cross and follow me. An
Right.
invitation into divinity, an invitation to the intensity of spiritual conflict. Yeah, gosh, that's makes me there's a lot more we could say, but how does that jive with what you know and what you've studied?
Yeah, it jives very well with what I'm thinking. I think that one of the biggest, in terms of a general principle, one of the biggest hermeneutical errors somebody can make is either thinking that the New Testament is in strict continuity with the Old Testament, so the whole Old Testament still applies, which
Yeah,
is an actual view of people like Theonomists and people in the kind of dominion theology
yeah,
area
yeah.
often have that kind of error. Christian nationalists have that kind of,
Mhm.
as they're thinking that there could be even such a thing as a Christian nation. That's
Yeah,
just not even that's a category mistake,
yeah.
bad implications. But yeah, that resonates very well. Again, to complete one earlier thought, I may have said this earlier, but I want to make sure I do say it, that John the Baptist wasn't wrong. He misunderstood how it was going to play out.
Yeah.
The book of Revelation, about which I've just recently published a commentary, also will talk about, just like Daniel, its message is, yeah, the world's falling apart, but don't be afraid. Don't be angry. Don't take over the culture. And you don't have to. You can live with confidence and hope because we know that God's coming in the future and he will rescue us. So,
Yeah, John reminds me of a lot of progressive, I'll say progressive. I don't know if I'd say pacifist, but they think the empire is the problem.
mm,
And the first difficulty I have with that is like Cyrus the Elder is literally called the Anointed in the
yeah.
Old Testament, in the canon. But which empire? Or like Persia, Syria, or I'm sorry, Syria. I'm getting confused, but Cyrus was an emperor, but he acted in a way that does not look like the way Augustus acted after the time of Christ. If there's something below that, then we can't really say it's the empire. I went through anti-war. I'm still anti-war, but like Iraq Veterans Against the War, as soon as I got out, I was doing activism, but I realized it was cyclical. We're not getting at the real problem. And as a veteran, like post-traumatic stress disorder is just the next iteration of shell shock, neurasthenia. There's all these new names for the same old thing. What's that old thing? And so that's how I like received John. He's not wrong, but he's oriented just slightly off kilter from Christ. And Christ is like, yes, this empire is a problem because the Battle of Philippi in 43 is the death of the Republic, the birth of the empire. And so Jesus sees it coming. John certainly saw it coming. But one of the distinctions that I try and point out to veterans and any scholar who will listen to me is like all of the Gospels occur before the Battle of Jerusalem and the destruction of the third temple, Herod's temple. And Jesus never goes to Caesarea Maritima. He never sees a light-skinned Italian soldier legionary. He's interacting with Syrian recruits, auxilia. He's a Captain Marvel, the centurion of great faith, is probably one of Herod's aristocrats who Luke and Matthew both call a hecaton tarchus, but that's this weird term that they don't understand as civilians. They're just like, he's got 100 men under him. But like in reality, he's something more like a noble. In John 4, which is it's the same guy. He has a child, a boy child that like needs healing, but he's probably brown skinned. And so Jesus doesn't have the same antagonistic attitude that John clearly does. And I see John every day in anti-war circles, but Jesus is like, there's just a little difference. And I wonder if that checks out with your scholarship. Like imperialism is bad, but if that's your problem, if it's like a specific administration, then you're missing the point. There's something underneath it that Jesus, I think, is pointing to.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for the chapter in which you talked about the nature of the Roman army, because I'm not a New Testament scholar, but it certainly makes a lot of sense to me what you're saying in terms of the nature.
I have to say, Christopher Zeichman and Lori Brink, I owe almost everything to them. They began writing after I got out of seminary in 2015, and I didn't have any of this when I was in seminary, but there's a lot more collaboration between Roman military historians and New Testament scholars that wasn't there when I was as late as 2014. But I just want to make sure I give credit where credit is due, but I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. But you might have to put me back on track here. So what's the underlying question again?
We're talking about the New Testament and what we can draw from in this overtly militarized or like materially forceful God of the Old Testament, and a Christ figure who's saying, yes, don't forget that, but now go deeper, go into the spiritual battle that the Old Testament or that the Israelite interaction with Yahweh is helping us see. Don't miss the forest for the trees. Don't get so involved in the here and now that you forget what's underneath it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think it does address the problem. I see it as a problem of some Christian approaches today to our general culture and society. And that is that we should know that the divine warrior is fighting the spiritual battle and that we can engage in it with things like prayer and other spiritual weapons, but to react with fear and anger, even over something like, let me just touch on another topic, religious liberty. An awful lot of Christians get all hot and bothered about religious liberty. First of all, in response to that, I'd say, yeah, there are issues, but no one has ever enjoyed more religious liberty by far than American Christians.
Yeah.
Number one. And then number two, realize that religious liberty, while there is a definite biblical basis for it in being created in the image of God and therefore freedom of conscience, and should be available to everyone, no matter what their religion or non-religion. It's absolutely not necessary, and often it's harmful to the church. The church tends to have serious problems when it has political power. And when it's marginalized, that's when it really often flourishes. And I saw this, I taught a lot. I'm not traveling as much to teach in my 70s, but just for fun now. But I used to teach a lot in Korea and in China. And I started teaching in Korea in the 80s. And that was a time when the church was just exploding. Over time, it got political power. And then it started being, and my Korean friends will tell you that this is a correct understanding, which is it became rife with corruption of various times, and then the church started collapsing. Whereas in China, where I also taught, which was a fun gig for about 7 years, I did just intensives in the philosophy department at the University of Beijing. But you can see how this church, which is being marginalized, was just exploding over there. And I don't know. So that's, I think, connected to what we're talking about, Logan. But
Yeah, I think I mean, there's so much more we can talk about. This interview has been such a great reminder, like being able to write this thing and revisit it and have conversations with the people that have inspired it. There's so much more that, yeah, I'm really grateful for you taking the time, Tremper. I want to wrap it up because I'm trying to keep these episodes under an hour, but I will be sure to share more of your books in the video and in the show notes. Do you have any parting words, any last words of wisdom before we sign off?
I'm not sure it's a word of wisdom, but it's a word of thanks to you. I really appreciated your book, and I hope as it comes out again, a whole bunch of people will read it, particularly veterans, but also non-veterans.
Yeah.
I live in Alexandria, Virginia. I have lots of veterans around me.
Yeah.
And I actually ask them, does it really make you mad when we say thank you for your service? And they go, yeah.
We don't like to tell you. We won't tell you unless we trust you, but it's divisive because we are not unified in
that's
our feelings of
a
it.
practical thing that helped me, but also not that we can't express in using non-formulaic words our appreciation.
Yeah.
But also, I just think you did really good work, biblical, theologically, and everything like that.
It's good to hear.
So,
I was kind of winging it at a coffee shop every couple of weeks, but it's really good to hear and reassuring. And I invite you along to the ride as I continue to edit. But thanks once again, Tremper Longman III. I will put all the stuff in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a good rest of your weekend and the rest of your flourishing career. It sounds like you've got a lot of books out. It's going to fill all the show notes. But it was really good talking to you.
Thanks, Logan.
Thank you.